Okay, thank you for joining us on this lovely fall afternoon in New York for the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I briefly want to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. I should note we are recording this video and posting it to the World War II Discussion Forum's YouTube channel immediately after, so something to keep in mind when asking the questions. We'll take about 25 minutes or so of questions and end the event at 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker. John Kinder is Director of American Studies and Professor of History at Oklahoma State University. He is the author of Paying with Their Bodies, American War and the Problem of the Disabled Veteran, published by the University of Chicago Press, and co-editor of Service Denied, Marginalized Veterans in Modern American History. Today, John will discuss his latest book, World War Zoos, Humans and Other Animals in the Deadliest Conflict of the Modern Age, also published by University of Chicago Press, which describes the story of how the world zoo survived the deadliest conflict of the 20th century and what was lost along the way. The reviews have been great. I'll just cite two. The Wall Street Journal highlights the fact the book combines academic rigor and genuine empathy to document extraordinary suffering, human and animal. The author rightly excoriates those who would abuse animals, but he also questions the wider relevance of zoos and the impositions of one's animal's right to keep another in a cage during times of war or peace. Daniel van der Sommers, author of Entangled Encounters at the National Zoo, Stories from the Animal Archive, concludes the book is incisive in its argument, ambitious in its scope, and disturbingly page-turning. John Kinder's World War Zoos takes readers on a haunting historical tour of zoological parks during one of the deadliest periods in human history. Whether you are interested in zoos, animal history, or World War II, this book is an absolute must-read for scholars, students, and animal lovers alike. World War Zoos will leave you with a raw perspective on war and an unforgettable account of 20th century zoo animals who were and are all too often taken for granted. I'm thrilled to have John, and I thought the book was fantastic, both in its account of the war and the animal sufferings. And with that, I will turn it over to John.
Well, thank you, Gregory, so much for inviting me to be here. I can't say how much I appreciate it. And thank you for everyone who's out there for tuning in today. Um, as he said, I will be happy to answer all kinds of questions that you have at the end of my brief talk today. And so I hope to hear from you and hear your experiences, not only with the zoo, but how you've come to, or if you've ever thought about this question of what happens to zoos in in wartime. Uh, I know that this topic might seem a bit strange, and that's what I often get when I tell people that I spent basically a decade thinking about zoos in wartime. But I want to make a case that it's exactly at times like these, times when the state of the world seems to be kind of in a really uncertain place, that we need to take animals and the institutions that we use to make sense of them seriously. And so, if nothing else, I hope that this book and events like this one will spur some of you to think about the ways in which animals are used, to borrow one of many kind of animal metaphors. And, once you start writing about animals, you start to see them everywhere. But, I kind of think of zoos as the kind of canaries in the coal mine when it comes to war, social unrest, environmental disruption, and so much more. So basically, if something bad in the world is happening, it's going to happen at a zoo. And it's going to happen and how it happens at a zoo is going to be really telling. At least that's sort of the impetus for the book. So As you can see here on this first slide, and I've got some, I hope, really interesting slides for you today. I've decided to organize this talk around two central questions, right? So the first question is, what happened to zoos during World War II, right? Like literally, what did they do? Did they shut down? Did they stay open? Were they bombed? How did they feed animals, right? All the kind of basic kind of nuts and bolts kind of questions. And then the second question is, why should we care, right? Given, and I've had a look at some of the other books that you've discussed on the forum. And, when we're thinking about these seemingly kind of grand historical events or these big historical questions, why should we care about what happens to the zoo? So uh, that's kind of why I'm here today. But of course, before we tackle this question, it's important to reflect on exactly what zoos are and what makes them uniquely vulnerable during periods of sustained military conflict, such as World War II. And this is something that I discovered in writing this book and thinking about this book. About like essentially what makes zoos different, right? What makes them different from other kinds of places, right? And so, of course, the main source of zoos' vulnerability is the fact that they house living creatures, right? As any person who kind of, if you've ever talked to anyone who works at a zoo, they'll tell you, running a zoo is really difficult in peacetime, right? Zoos require food, fresh water, labor, fuel, medicine, right? All of these things that are in short supply during times of war, right? During times of privation, during times of rationing. And this is what distinguishes zoos from, say, natural history museums or art museums, right? Throughout World War II, for example, museum curators would often be quite adept at hiding artworks from falling bombs or from invading armies, right? You could take a Renaissance painting and bury it. You could store it in a cave, or as was the case in the UK, you could secret it away to a Scottish castle. And this is what happened. A lot of artworks were placed in old castles in Scotland, where presumably, it would be out of harm's way, right? Indeed, you know, uh, World War II era zoos were often located in city centers, right? Which made them, basically ground zero for a potential enemy attack, right? So they were vulnerable because they had living creatures. They were vulnerable because of geography, location. And so, this idea of, you know, taking animals out of the zoo and placing them somewhere else, right? This wasn't an option for most zoo animals. So the second bit of vulnerability had to do with the fact that, uh, this was a time when all institutions, right, from sports leagues to movie studios, were expected to do their bit, right? They were expected to help out in some way in the war effort. And the same thing was, the case with zoos, right? Zoos had to justify their wartime existence to often quite skeptical military leaders and politicians, right? So, we can easily understand, say, how Ford Motors could contribute to the war effort. But what about the Brookfield Zoo, right? So this is one thing that zoos had to grapple with. Zoos were also victims of their own mythology, right? And what I mean by that is that for over a century, modern zoos played up the danger of housing exotic creatures, right? Especially the big cats, right? So the idea would be these creatures are so wild, they're so dangerous, they're so threatening that if they were let loose, they would be a hazard. Well, what would happen? Some in the public would complain if a bomb fell on a lion's cage and set man-eating beasts loose in the city, right? So, zoos had to kind of deal with this story they had been telling about the dangers of these wild creatures that they kept, right? Now, I should also say that zoos had several things going for them. Of course, if you're a zoo lover, you know that zoo animals often inspire genuine affection and sympathy among keepers and visitors alike. Moreover, zoos had a higher cultural value in the 1940s than they do today. I mean, today we often associate zoos with children, right? We don't really think about zoos on the same level we think of, the great art museums and cultural institutions of the day. That wasn't exactly the case, though, in the 1940s. And I'll read you one quote. And I don't like reading quotes in talks that much, but I'll read you this one. And so this comes from Walter Vandenberg, who ran the Antwerp Zoo throughout World War II. And he put it this way, right? He said, "The Antwerp Zoo has a peculiar place in the affections of our citizens. For more than 100 years, it has been here in the heart of the city. Most citizens of Antwerp came here as children with their grandparents. They played here in their school days. Many of them met their future fiancés here, and almost all of them did some of their courting here. Now they bring their children, and in years to come, will bring their grandchildren, right?" And this is kind of what zoos were. Zoos were more than just a place that happened to hold animals, right? Zoos were these really kind of important civic and social institutions, particularly in larger cities where, they stood in for a public park, a meeting place, a convention ground, all these things. So, in some zoos were uh, uh, incredibly vulnerable in wartime, and yet most zoos did stay open despite everything, right? So that's what I want to kind of get at in today's talk, and that's what I talk about in the book, right? So at this point, I want to step back and give you an overview of World War zoos and what I hope to achieve. So from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to tell two stories. Basically, the story of how the war impacted zoos, right? And how zoos can help us understand certain aspects of World War II. In fact, when I was setting up the book, I knew I kind of wanted to write what I sometimes call a Barnes and Noble style World War II book. That is, if you go to Barnes and Noble and you're looking around for a World War II book and for a big overview, you know what you're going to get, right? You're going to start with the rise of the Nazis, and you're going to start with the invasion of Poland, and then we're going to move to the Netherlands and the invasion of France. And at some, you're going to hit like all of these high points along, like all of these familiar, points that show up in every kind of overview of World War II. Well, that's kind of what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to sort of tell that familiar World War II arc, but from the perspective of the zoo. And that's basically what I do. Right. So the book, of course, starts out in the 1930s, right? Talking about the Great Depression. Um, we can, we follow the breakdown of the international order and the rise of militant nationalism, especially in places like Nazi Germany, right? So much of the book looks at the ways in which Nazi Germany both embraced the zoo but used the zoo as a vehicle for spreading their ideals. So this is a very well, I don't want to say it's a famous picture. This is a picture of Adolf Hitler at the Nuremberg Zoo in 1938. Now, of course, if you know, those, Barnes and Noble World War II books, you know about the Nuremberg rallies, right? What you might not know is that the rally grounds were right next to the Nuremberg Zoo. And in fact, as the rallies would get bigger and bigger and the grounds would expand, they started, leaking onto the grounds of the Nuremberg Zoo. So what actually happened was, with the help of Adolf Hitler and the help of other Nazi higher ups, um, the old Nuremberg Zoo was basically torn down, and a new zoo was built in its place, right? And this is Adolf Hitler touring that new zoo. Now, Adolf Hitler was not an especially avid zoo goer. unlike a number of other top Nazi officials. But he nevertheless, saw this as really important. And, I'd be happy to kind of talk about the relationship between zoos and the Nazi Party. But, this kind of shows how, sort of how important they were, like to this in this moment. So even as it's torn down, it's built back up. Uh, so I talk about that. You can also see in the Spanish Civil War, for example, um, how we get pretty much a preview of everything that would happen in World War II. So I spend a chapter talking about how zoos in Madrid and Barcelona survived the war, what happened. And in that chapter, what we see is basically kind of everything that happens to those zoos is going to be amplified in the war, the Greater War. So once the war started itself, you know, many zoos basically mirrored kind of the societies around them, right? So that included things like security protocols, right? Here we have some photographs of air raid precautions being carried out at the London Zoo. So the London Zoo is one of the zoos that I profile in great detail in the book. It's a really important zoo for a number of reasons. It was a very large zoo. It was a very highly publicized zoo, and in many ways, what happened at the London Zoo would set the tone for how many of the Allies would react to the war. So here we see some air raid precautions being carried out. You have the camel, George carrying sandbags. You have a boa constrictor being packed away. A number of the venomous snakes, a number of the venomous spiders at the London Zoo were executed, killed within 3 days of the opening of the war. And in fact, a number of animals would be killed over the first 3 months preemptively, right? And this became kind of a plan, right? The idea would be that, what should animals, what should zoos do in the face of, potential threats? Well, one answer that would be associated with the London Zoo would be that you kill your most dangerous animals and you try to ride it out with the rest, right? So, zoos endured, like I said, zoos mirrored many of the security protocols of their host nations that include air raid precautions, evacuations, retreats. Over the course of the zoo, here again is another image of kind of sandbags at the Bristol Zoo in the UK, right? We see the flamingos up at the top. Okay. So zoos endured aerial bombardments and mortar fire, for example. Here we have uh, Dierenpark, or this is a private zoo in the Netherlands. Basically, it was located in atop a ridge that was considered militarily strategic, right? In other words, there was a sense that German invading armies would hit this ridge, and thus they had to figure out what would happen to the zoo, right? So a number of the animals would be preemptively slaughtered. Many of them were crocodiles and alligators. And then, of course, the zoo would be bombed. Near the end of the war, for example, the Breslau Zoo, which was temporary home for animals from throughout Germany, was bombed, right? Through much of the war, it was considered safe from American planes, which it pretty much was, but no one ever thought that it would be attacked from the east, which is exactly what happened. And when I mentioned before that zoos were often located in city centers, this was the exact case with the Breslau Zoo. It's located right near a series of bridges over militarily significant rivers. And so, as the Soviets were bombing, mortaring their way in, right, trying to destroy the bridges, of course, they landed on the zoo, right? So, like I said, zoos kind of mirrored the security protocols. They would be bombed, they would be hit by mortar fire. Um, Zoos faced invasion, they faced occupation. Zookeepers had to grapple with the question of whether to collaborate with occupiers or to resist them. In fact, one of my favorite chapters of the book focuses on efforts to hide workers and Jewish Dutch citizens at the Artist Zoo in Amsterdam. Um, it's another image from of the Breslau Zoo, right? Hit by a mortar fire. Um, Another image of a zoo that was hit by aerial bombardment. This is the zoo, Burger Zoo, which is in Arnhem. So if you know anything about the Operation Market Garden, or you've seen the movie The Bridge Too Far, right? You very much know this. So you know that the bridge that's kind of from the Netherlands over to Germany, right? Well, right next to it, right in Arnhem, was a zoo. And, I talk about how the people who worked at this particular zoo were told to evacuate in the lead up to the campaign, but they couldn't, right? So they decided to stay. And in doing so, they decided, they nearly were killed by, in this case, Allied bombs. There were zoos in concentration camps, most famously at Buchenwald, where a zoo was built to amuse camp guards and to remind prisoners of their less than animal status. But there were also zoos at Sachsenhausen and at the killing center of Treblinka. Um, this is a wooden sign that was produced by prisoners at Buchenwald concentration camp. It, says to Buchenwald Garden, and with an arrow, and it basically shows some of the animals that were held captive there. So you see like a pig and a bear and various things there, right? So in fact, if you've gone to Buchenwald, you know that there's the uh, the central yard where prisoners would be forced to stand and wait for hours on end, and then the barbed wire. And then about, I don't know, 10 feet away on the other side of the barbed wire, is the place where the bears were held, right? So again, the idea would be to not only to amuse concentration camp guards, but also to teach the people who were in Buchenwald that they were had less status than animals. This is a handwritten illustrated poem that I got from Buchenwald. It's called A Bear Hunt in KZ Buchenwald. And basically, it tells the story of Betty the bear, who was kept at Buchenwald, and about how she escaped, right? So once one image shows the cover, the other shows kind of this illustration of prisoners there building the cage. And at all of these zoos, they had to be built with prisoner labor. The food came out of prisoners' food, right? The medicine came from the prisoners. In fact, at Buchenwald, one of the prime jobs was to actually care for the animals. Not necessarily because people liked the animals, but because the idea was that maybe they could get some of the animal scraps. In other words, the animals kept at Buchenwald ate better than the humans, right? Holocaust survivors use the metaphor of being in a zoo to describe their camp experiences over and over again. And many of the people who liberated the camps would say, like, it was just like a zoo. It was just like a zoo. And so many, people who survived the Holocaust came away with thinking about that. So if the idea is, I've been in this concentration camp and it reminds me of a zoo, how should I think about zoos now, right? Of course, Japanese Americans also had similar kind of thoughts, right? Japanese Americans at Heart Mountain Internment Camp maintained a zoo, right? So this is Arthur Ishigo and his dog at Heart Mountain Internment Center in Wyoming. There was The zoo at Heart Mountain was basically a petting zoo. People collected animals, rattlesnakes, rabbits, all kinds of things from around there and kept them in a zoo. And it was sort of in this, uh, basically kind of right near the main community center in the camp. And the person who ran it, the top zookeeper, would be uh, was part of the group that would help liberate Dachau. So, he was able to kind of think about his experience, the zoo and the concentration camp. So, zoos would suffer throughout the war's violent aftermath. Having survived all of this time, the question would be, what now? So here we see some zoos, some elephants from Hamburg's Hagenbeck Zoo being put to work. Um, Many zoos suffered throughout the war from hunger, from bomb attacks, from all these things. In fact, at the start of the war, Berlin Zoo, which was the world's largest, had about 3,000 animals. By the end, it had about 71, right? So that shows you the level of destruction. And of course, the atomic bomb transformed humans' relationship with nature. It spurred people to think about the destruction of all life on Earth, and it spurred zoos to kind of commit themselves to goals like species protection and conservation, right? As for how the war impacted the zoo, basically it made everything more difficult. It made certain kinds of food almost impossible to find, like certain kinds of citrus fruits and certain kinds of fish. Fuel was rationed, rubber was rationed, visitors dropped, cities reduced budgets, broken exhibits went unrepaired, zoos lost workers, dead animals went unreplaced. And of course, there was the dangers of bombing and invasion and looting and theft. So how did they survive all of this? Well, this is one of the stories I like to tell. Basically, zoos got creative, right? They grew victory gardens. They instituted what they called patriotic diets, which would mean like replacing normal animal food with other kinds of animal food. So, they would take cheap pieces of meat that would usually be fed to cats, dip it in cod liver oil, and pass it off to the seals, for example, as fresh fish, right? And they had all of these kinds of what they called ersatz foods. In Axis countries, enslaved workers were used to meet the labor demands, while zoos in the U.S., in Britain, and Australia hired women, many for the first time. Right? In fact, that's what we see here. We see some female workers at the San Diego Zoo. In fact, the head of the San Diego Zoo during this time, a woman named Belle Benchley, was a woman. But most zoos throughout this period had no women workers, with the exception of people who worked with the baby animals. Zoo work was considered man's work. But just like everything else, like so many other industries during World War II, women stepped in as men went off and did other things. The one exception was zoos in the Soviet Union, right? So here we have some images of some female workers at the Moscow Zoo. And so if you'd gone to the Moscow Zoo in the years leading up to the war, many of the workers were women. And by, right around the 1940s, 97% of Russian zoo workers were women, right? Zoos, as I mentioned, they instituted security measures, they instituted protocols, what to do in case of invasion. They tried to make themselves useful during the war, whether that meant milking snakes for anti-venom, which was done at zoos in DC and Philadelphia, um, to developing survival plans for troops that were stationed in jungle environments, which is there was a Lost in the Pacific exhibit held at the Bronx Zoo, and it basically says, if you get shot down over Borneo, here's what to eat, watch out for these animals, don't touch this plant. And millions of people came by taking notes to say, and so zookeepers and zoologists and biologists were kind of brought into this um, war effort. And of course, like this sort of war work included different kinds of propaganda as well, right? So in Nazi Germany, you'd find zoos festooned with swastikas and saying things like "No zoos allowed." Top Nazis would be photographed at zoos. Joseph Goebbels and others like to incorporate the zoo and lessons about the ferocity of animals into their rants about German supremacy. And the image of the kind Wehrmacht soldier at the zoo would be used to frame animals as, or Germans as benign conquerors. So you see images like this, right? So these are Wehrmacht troops at the Prague Zoo. These are a German zoo, soldier in a zoo in Ukraine. There would be images like this published in Paris, and the idea would be, look, these German soldiers, they're not so bad, right? They're not so bad occupiers. Look at them, friendly, nice, polite, going to the zoo, right? So the zoo became this kind of propaganda tool. So when it came to propaganda, zoos in allied nations typically made a big deal of animals' willingness to forego their normal diets for the purpose of the war. They were photographed or illustrated, engaged in various kinds of patriotic tasks. Take Ming the panda, who I'm seeing on my right side of my screen. So Ming the panda was evacuated at the beginning of the Blitz, right? He and a number of high-profile animals, or she and a number of high-profile animals, was evacuated to a zoo in about 45 miles outside of London called Whipsnade, right? And then, of course, after the kind of after a while, Ming came back, right? And the idea would be that if Ming the panda is willing to live through the Blitz, then so can ordinary Londoners. And this is a picture of Ming, right? So he's back, right? And he's got his London to Whipsnade kind of sticker. He's got his ration booklets, right? He's got his air raid hat, right? And the idea is that Ming is coming back. Things are safe. In the other hand, we see this an off the ration exhibition that was held at the London Zoo. In this case, basically, it's designed to teach you um, how to raise vegetables, how to raise pigs, how to raise rabbits, how to raise chickens, right? So the idea is that we're not going to be so dependent on ration cars, right? We're going to, grow our own food and so forth. So the zoo was often kind of integrated into these propaganda campaigns. Here's an image of Eleanor Roosevelt as part of her kind of tour of the Pacific, right? And she would go and meet the troops and so forth. So here she is at a zoo in Melbourne, Australia. She hated that koala too. Like it was very mean and tried to bite her. And this funny story, is that she didn't want to touch it at all. But like she knew for the good of the troops and for the good of the image, like she had to hold the koala and smile. But the koala looks kind of mad. Um, so. Uh, One of the big arguments I make in this book is that World War II was not an an exception. That is, it was not a state of exception in which introduced ethical dilemmas, new ethical dilemmas into zoo life. What it actually did was take some of the ordinary kind of things that zoos grapple with and drive them out into the public, right? Usually you don't see what went behind the scenes at a zoo, but during wartime, when you were forced to ask for, you beg for money, for labor, that sort of thing, you know, certain things that you would normally not see were pushed, to the surface, right? So people and the public got to see zoos grappling with questions like, what's the whole purpose of a zoo, right? What was the goal to remain open at all costs? Was it to save as many animals as possible? Was it to preserve the favorites, right? The animals that the public most wanted to see? Um, what should happen when food supplies ran low, right? Which animals should be killed to predict or to protect or prolong the lives of others? Questions like, when did it make sense to destroy animals, or at least some of them, right? I mentioned the London Zoo earlier, right? In the early fall of September of 1939, the London Zoo kind of did an audit of all of its animals and asked questions like, did it really need 24 bears when food stocks were already thin? And ultimately, they decided they didn't. They decided that 8 could go, right? And they picked out the ones they already that were a little bit redundant, that were a little bit boring. Not the polar bears. The polar bears were safe, but some of the other bears were shot, were poisoned, were killed, right? Did it make sense to waste grain on ungulates, basically cattle, things, animals that the public doesn't really care about, when they might serve a better purpose as meat for more charismatic beasts, right? Was it better to preemptively slaughter lions and tigers rather than to sentence them to long, painful deaths by starvation or short, painful deaths by incendiary bombing, right? So, some animals, as I mentioned, were killed in anticipation of military invasions, right? I mentioned that zoo in the Netherlands that was right atop of that ridge that was considered militarily vulnerable. That's where Maxie and her cubs live. Maxie was a polar bear, and she was initially going to be killed, right? Right up until that moment. But the zoo owner and main zookeeper were able to argue with the Dutch army and basically, argue that they were too important. They were too valuable to be executed. So they were spared. However, Maxie's mate, the male polar bear, was killed, right? So, and so in many ways, like zoos are making these kinds of decisions all the time. But in World War II, they were public, right? And they were given this extra uh, cultural heft because of the situation, right? So animals were killed in anticipation of military invasions, others for military research purposes, others were considered more valuable dead than alive. Nowhere was this more the case than in Japan. In 1943, the Tokyo governor ordered the zoo to carry out a series of morale or propaganda killings that were designed to convince the Japanese public of the need to sacrifice for the war effort, right? The idea is that, that the idea was that the Japanese people were getting a little too soft, a little too complacent, right? They needed to see, just how much, just what was at stake. And so the military governor of Tokyo decided, ordered the zoo to kill a number of animals, and often in very gruesome ways. Like animals, bears were strangled. One rattlesnake had an electrode kind of stuck into its head to see if that would kill it, like if electricity would kill it. Eventually, they wound up decapitating it. But the most famous victims were the 3 elephants that were allowed to starve to death, right? These were, and so, even as the public and Tokyo school children came to the zoo to mourn the animal martyrs, the elephants were slowly dying behind in their cages, but it was covered up by this big kind of sheets of striped bunting, right? So the public would not see it, right? In the weeks it would take them to die, they performed tricks for their keepers. They were desperate to win any food, right? and eventually they too died, right? And of course, like when it came to euthanizing these animals, the biggest justification was this threat of escape, right? So many zoos had to grapple with this. All right, so I know I'm kind of going on too long. I want to draw this close, but I want to return to that other question that I started with, which is basically, why should we care about this? Um, I want to end by saying, zoos can teach us a lot about World War II. For one thing, zoos were incredibly popular, even at the height of the war. Stories of zoo deaths and births and deaths attracted front page attention. Some of the most influential figures of the war were avid zoo goers: Churchill, Mussolini, Goering. At the same time, zoos were microcosms of the cities in which they existed. Basically, a zoo was often like a miniature citadel filled with sandbags and escape plans and all these air raid plans, all these kinds of things. But above else, I think that looking at zoos allows us to grasp some difficult questions dealt with that home front populations had to grapple with. And here I'm thinking about things like, what do we owe to the beings that are held captive? Like in difficult times, who or what most deserves to live, right? And is it better to sacrifice entertainment in times of total war? Or does the wartime public need avenues of entertainment and escape, right? And so this was a question that people would ask about movies, they would ask about music, and they would also ask about zoos. So, in that sense, it's just, I see this book as just a reminder that the traumas of war, that the upheavals of war, they weren't just confined to the battlefield, right? Not even the city zoo could escape the war unscathed, right? So, with that, I want to see if anyone has any questions.
Uh, Thanks, John. That was a great talk. There are a few questions in the queue, and Mike, I see you already have your hand raised, which is great. I'll just take the three in the queue and then turn it over to you, Mike. And if anyone else has questions, I think you know the drill, but please type it in the Q&A box or raise your hand. The first, John, is just how did you get interested in this topic? It seems a little offbeat. That comes from Arturo.
Oh, so I became interested in this topic because I was visiting the Berlin Zoo in the 1990s. And at the Elephant House, there was a photo memorial that showed the original pachyderm house in the aftermath of a bombing. And it basically shows a bunch of rubble with an elephant's foot sticking out of the rubble. And it didn't say anything else. It didn't say the role of the zoo in the war, and the head of the zoo in the war was basically best friends with Hermann Goering. He was a top Nazi. So it didn't show, it didn't say like suggest, was this intentional? Was this an accident? Did this happen all the time? It didn't, give any context. And I sort of got mad because, if you've been to Germany, you know that it's hard to make a World War II memorial in Germany. And so it felt like a way for them to kind of get around that by saying, we can memorialize these innocent zoos or these innocent animals as a way of kind of talking about the horrors and the tragedy of war without really trying to take any uh, blame or any responsibility for the role that the zoo and Germany played in the war itself. And so that always got me thinking. And years and years later, I finally took it up.
Interesting. John, would you mind stop sharing your screen? Just, I think right now we can see your desktop and
Oh,
yeah, perfect. Next question from Charles asks about, were any animals protected either by public opinion or the higher military brass?
yes, they definitely were, right? So, most zoos tried to single out their most important animals. I mentioned that that the story of the Tokyo Zoo, and that becomes in a chapter about sacrifice, and that story is paired with the story of Soviet zoos, especially the zoo in Leningrad, and this is the most famous story of sacrifice on behalf of animals through the war, right? So if you know the story of Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad, you know like the horrible degree of famine and starvation. And yet, throughout all of that, you had not only the zookeepers who were basically themselves starving, right? Basically working for nothing. But members of the public going out, finding scraps of food, bringing it to the animals. One of the most famous animals was the hippo, right? And in order to keep this hippo alive, the main zookeeper, she had to walk down to the river every day to get water and miles in the snow and then back up and heat it up and then would ladle it over the hippo's back and rub in oil because if it doesn't have access to it, the hippo's skin will crack. And so they did all of these things, right? Because they thought it was their patriotic duty to do so, because Stalin didn't want these important cultural institutions to be broken by German invasion, right? And so to this day, if you go to the Soviet Union or Russia, it's not called the St. Petersburg Zoo. It's called the Leningrad Zoo, in honor of the sacrifice of the keepers. And this is the most famous example of this, but I also talk about a story in Belfast during the Belfast Blitz. One female zookeeper, she would every day walk the baby elephant from the zoo down to her back garden where it would stay overnight and then walk it back. And so by the end, you had in Germany, and especially you had animals that were living in bathtubs, animals that were living in apartments, animals that were kept home, people sharing their food with animals. And so, part of this book you can kind of read as this story about, humans' willingness to kill animals, right? But at the same time, there are all of these stories of people really risking their lives, in some cases giving their lives to protect animals. And zoo animals. And so that's sort of why I kind of think these places are so interesting.
Yeah, a few questions about, I think you mentioned a zoo in a particular concentration camp. Could you explain
Mhm.
a little bit more about that, with the workers, how that was structured, I think?
Okay, so I should say that zoos were incredibly popular in Germany, right? Germany was considered the center of the zoo world, and there were more zoos and bigger zoos, and the most modern zoos in the early 20th century were in Germany. And uh, zoos had many high-profile backers within the Nazi Party. Hermann Goering was the most famous, but there were plenty of others. By the start of World War II, only one zookeeper, that is the or one zoo director, the head of the Munich Zoo, was not a member of the Nazi Party, right? And so, and zoos, I mean, plenty of people have written about kind of the relationship between Nazi ideology and a certain kind of uh, 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 blood and soil sort of sensibility. Well, zoos played into that, right? So a lot of kind of top Nazi figures really adored the zoo, and they saw zoos as a very important institution. So when Buchenwald concentration camp got uh, a new head. He came in and he helped sort of push along this project to create a zoo on the campgrounds. It wasn't the only one, right? Like I mentioned, there were a number of these. It was the biggest, it was the most important. And he did it for a couple of reasons, right? He himself liked to go to the zoo, right? So there are lots of pictures of Cook and his son kind of feeding the deer, that sort of thing. He also believed it was really important to instill certain kinds of lessons to the camp guards, right? And one of the lessons was that, you can abuse the prisoners all you want, but don't lay a finger on the animals, right? So he wanted to kind of, he saw like the zoo as a kind of civilizing agent, a training tool, right, for this, right? So he saw it as entertainment because the idea is you've got to give these camp guards something to do, right? And so, but he also saw it as a kind of educational tool, and he saw this as an educational tool for the prisoners themselves. The idea that they are going to be reminded every day that these animals are in cages, you're in cages, right? You know, uh, uh, you're both dependent upon food from us, but they get the better food. Like that's where your status is. Now, the zoo at Treblinka is a little different because Treblinka, it was basically, it wasn't meant for anyone to actually live there long term, right? So the idea was that the that people who worked at the camp might go to the zoo, but if you've read about Treblinka, you know that so much of it is kind of this, almost movie set, right? This movie set of a train station and flowers and like, oh, this place isn't so bad, and this who knows, maybe this, and then just as a way to kind of keep people in place, or keep people kind of under control until you get to the point of execution. But of course, one thing I discovered is, and actually, that's what I sort of thought the zoo was going to be, just another prop in that. But actually, if you sort of looked at the way in which the people were herded out of the cattle cars and down, they couldn't actually see the zoo, right? So the zoo was, again, like really there. And the head of the Treblinka concentration camp, he talked a lot about basically a lot of that stuff, a lot of the kind of civilizing, including the zoo and various, it was meant for the guards. And as he talked about it in the 70s, he said, basically it was a way for us to live with what we were doing. Like, to kind of, because if it just seemed like, oh, what we're actually doing is, you know, the mass production of murder, we can't live with that. But if we can kind of give it a sense of normalcy, make it seem like we can almost trick the camp guards, the executioners, just long enough to allow them to keep doing this work, because otherwise there would be psychological breakdown and burn. And that's actually what the zoo did. But these things were well known. I mean, I found a French newspaper article where a French journalist goes to the zoo at Sachsenhausen, and he was a very kind of pro-fascist, and he's given a tour, and basically the head of the camp says, "See, these places aren't that bad. They've even got a zoo," and they had a backflipping monkey, and they showed off the backflipping monkey to the journalists and say, "See, these places, we're not what you think we are, right? We're zoo lovers. How bad could we be?"
Interesting. Two more questions in the queue. One, I think you answered this, but do zoos remain, excuse me, open to the public during wartime, particularly in London and Germany?
Yeah, in London, so London shut down basically for 3 days. They completely shut down the aquarium, because they feared broken glass in a bombing, and so a lot of the animals from the aquarium, with the exception of a handful of really valuable fish, were killed. There was several zoos. There was a zoo in Iowa that completely shut down. There was a zoo in Hershey, Pennsylvania, that completely shut down. And basically, the idea was that they shot all the animals because they couldn't justify using meat in times of war. And the Hague Zoo was shut down. Basically, the Hague Zoo became a center for Dutch Nazis, like going off to fight on the Eastern Front. So, the Hague Zoo would be the place because a lot of these old zoos, they had huge convention centers. And so Dutch Nazis would come in and they would give them their big going away party at the Hague Zoo and so forth. So it was shut down because it was considered too militarily important. And so all the animals from there were sent to places like Rotterdam and elsewhere. Yeah, so there were places, and of course there was one zoo in Germany that shut down and did not reopen in Frankfurt. But for the most part, most zoos really tried to stay open, and they tried to stay open despite everything, despite occupation, despite bombing raids. Like Berlin would be devastated, and it was up and running within a few days. So.
Wow. Last question in the queue before we go to Mike. Were any of the animals transferred to other zoos, particularly allied countries from access? Were there any
Yes.
cross-sharing of animals? I don't know if that's the right word.
Well, yeah, so there was all kinds of animal transfers. I mentioned the evacuation of animals in Great Britain. In Germany, there were all kinds of evacuations, particularly as the war got along. So I mentioned some that were sent east, right? Some also were sent from places like down to Vienna, right? And which was considered out of harm's way. The A number of zoos, the Moscow Zoo and the Leningrad Zoo, they evacuated a number of their animals. But unfortunately, what happened in the Soviet Union was people really cared about their animals, their city animals. But suddenly, you're in a city 5 hours away and a trainload of animals comes in and your zoo is already starving. Basically you say, keep going, right? So a lot of occupied animals or evacuated animals in the Soviet Union um, were actually killed. They would be the bombs would fall on the trains, or the animals would kind of starve to death, like because they would not, right? And of course, after the war, there were some animals that were taken from conquered zoos to the other. So some German animals wound up in, behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia and in Moscow. And for a short while, some animals were evacuated from the Hamburg Zoo to Great Britain for safekeeping,
Yeah.
although they were eventually brought back.
No. I thought like the Elgin Marbles safekeeping.
No, it was exactly, and that's how people said it's like we're not going to get these things back,
Yeah. Um,
but they got some of them back. Yeah.
Question from me and Mike, I promise this is the last one. Were there any particular animals when you talked about captured or taken that were prized by other side? I mean, I don't know, bears, panda bears, lions, tigers.
Panda
Any,
bears are always the most prized.
yeah, yeah.
Um, you know, um, at this point, there weren't that many panda bears out. There weren't that many pandas out there. In fact, the book opens with a story of Americans trying to get pandas from China and having to kind of fly through Japanese defenses and so forth. Pandas were very rare. Uh, uh, Polar bears were considered especially prized. And there were certain kinds of wild horses that were taken from zoos in what's now Ukraine, right? And they were brought back to Germany. And there were several kinds of animals that, the Nazi ideologues really kind of viewed as sort of kind of proto-European, almost medieval style animals. And some very rare horses, were especially prized. And so some of those animals were stolen from Warsaw, they were stolen from Ukraine, they were brought back to Berlin, and eventually they wound up at Hermann Goering's hunting lodge, where they would be killed by the end of the war.
Wow. Mike, you're up. If you want to unmute your line.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Very interesting talk. Certainly an aspect of the Second World War, which we normally don't discuss. But I have two questions. The first of which is in. I mean, if you look at if we talk about the elephant at the Japanese zoo that was starved to death, why weren't animals such as that, like elephants, can be used to move rubble, for instance? They could have been put to good use for especially when the bombings started to get intensify in 1944. Why weren't they put to use in these zoos for, shall we say, the same way that a animal used in service in the military, and if any of them were used in the military, basically basically conscripted into the military, but why weren't they also used for more practical reasons, especially those animals would be useful for that and weren't considered dangerous should the zoo be bombed and the animals escape?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Well, I can ask the second
Yeah.
question after.
Well, I can. So some of them were, right. I had that photograph of animals or elephants moving rubble at the Hamburg Zoo. There was there were images of this, this sort of thing actually happened in World War I, right? All kinds of animals were used for practical purposes. A bear was donated for chemical warfare experiments, for example, and they did electronic. They did experiments having to do with submarines on electric eels at the Bronx Zoo, for example. So there was stuff like that. But there were these examples of exactly what you think, because zoos were always interested in having their animals out in the public doing things, contributing to things. This is also why a lot of zoos would hold military mascots, right? Either when you're off fighting or at basically when the military mascot retires, goes to stay in the zoo, right? Zoos were always trying to build these connections. But one of the most famous stories of this involved the Munich Zoo. So at the end of the war, as the German army is retreating, what they want to do is to clog up all of the streets, to slow down the Americans, right? And they drag all this rubble and all of these huge tree trunks, right, out there to kind of block the road. Well, the head of the Munich Zoo goes out and he gets his elephants to pull them away, right? In other words, to almost like, clear a path for the Americans. And he actually was very friendly to the Americans before the war. He was the only German zoo director not to join the Nazi Party. And this endeared him to the American forces, right? And so he was able to get all kinds of food from the American military, basically from the U.S. From the kitchens and so forth to feed the animals. And so, like, this kind of symbolic moment was really important. So this definitely did happen, but often what you saw this kind of, like, especially with elephants, in the aftermath of battle, like because there was a great fear of these animals stampeding, right? If they hear loud noises, exploding bombs, that sort of thing. So the Japanese example is just very different. Like I said, it was meant to be a propaganda killing, and in essence, the idea was that it doesn't work. It's not affecting if just some random animal is killed. Like, so they intentionally starved the most beloved animals at the zoo, and that were these, prized elephants.
Right. Well, that must have had a great effect on the Japanese children.
Uh,
Probably the opposite effect that they intended. But the second question, and that does kind of sort of lead into the second question, which is that, I mean, it seems to me that how they dealt with the animals very often was more akin in a certain way to the Holocaust. Um, Animals were selected for survival, it seems very often, not on how rare they were or how important they were, but how popular they were. And this kind of selection process is kind of disturbing. And I was wondering how that played out and how that might have affected people's attitudes towards animals in zoos after the war.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad you asked this. You know, this is one of the more difficult and tricky questions to deal with in a book like this one. I talk about in the book how, in many ways, any kind of Holocaust analogy can quickly backfire, like as a way of saying that, well, you're discounting this singularly evil, epic kind of horrible act by comparing it to what happens with animals. So I was always kind of very careful how I did that. That said, exactly what you described it exactly, right? Not only did people, Nazi kind of ideologues, as they were talking about humans, they were talking about animals, they were talking about the different status of the species, when they're kind of describing their definitions of Übermenschen and so forth, they talked about it in exactly the same ways, right? Some groups, some living beings deserve to live, right? Others do not, right? I sort of talk about how that kind of logic, that way of thinking, that way of kind of distinguishing between groups as some worthy of life, others unworthy of life, right? That's sort of built into the zoo itself, right? The zoo has to fundamentally change because, that comes from this longer set of ideas that are inherent in Western culture about hierarchy and so forth. And so one of the ways I tried to deal with that, I mean, I would raise that over and over again, but I sort of looked at, and I really tried to pay attention to how did people who survived the Holocaust, how did they think about these things, right? And one thing you can kind of see is that, and I'm not saying that everyone who survived, but you see a striking number of people who survived the Holocaust and who reflect on it exactly the same way. They reflect on it as a way of thinking about their relationship with nature. So a number of people come out of it, the Holocaust, and become very critical of factory farms, very critical of zoos, very critical of just the kind of cruelty to animals in general. And what they say is essentially, I've been inside that cage, right? And so now I have a sense of empathy that for others, right? And whether those are other humans, other animals, who are enduring this very same place. But your point about how this idea of selection, right? It happens at every zoo, right? Every zoo is sort of at some level rooted in this idea that there are certain animals that are worth it, that are worth more, that are more valuable. And so that people want, and then there are others that just aren't. And that in really tough times, we're going to make these decisions that say, hey, these people, these we can let go of in order to preserve this thing, right? And so yeah, that was a theme that runs throughout the book. And that's kind of, I end the book sort of with this asking questions of how the zoo is going to survive and what it's going to have to look like. And, part of what troubled me as I was doing this book was uncovering that logic that you describe over and over and over again. And not just in Germany, in London, in the United States, right? In France, in Japan.
Thank you. Well said. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Great question, and that's probably a great place to end the talk. Again, thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. The book is World War Zoos, Humans and Other Animals in the Deadliest Conflict of the Modern Age. It's a wonderful book, fascinating topic. Please join us next Saturday, September 20th at 1 p.m. when David Winkler, who will speak on his book, Witness to Neptune's Inferno, the Pacific War Diary of Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Mustin from the USS Atlanta, which offers a rare day-to-day accounting from a very opinionated officer, beginning with the commissioning of the Atlanta at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on Christmas Eve 1941 to the Battle of Santa Cruz in late October 1942. Hopefully you can join us. Thank you again, John. That was really a fascinating talk.
Oh, I really appreciate your asking me.
No, great to have you. And thanks for our audience, and hope to see everyone next Saturday. Until then, enjoy the weekend. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.